Very good afternoon. Just to give you a quick introduction about myself, I lead the public sector consulting space for Frost & Sullivan. We are a global consultancy and research firm and have different industrial practices such as business and financial services, ICT, healthcare, automotive, and so on. But the practice I lead is related to public sector and government. As part of that, we also not just work with government agencies, ministries around the world, but also with non-governmental organizations, associations, as well as multilateral organizations. Our work particularly centers around socio-economic developmental issues, coming up with strategies for countries or regions to develop their regions, at the same time going all the way to implementation and monitoring and evaluation. So what I'll do today, I don't think I can take all the 2 hours that I have for this afternoon, so it will be an early break for most of you. But what I'll try to do today is to give a brief introduction about some of the recent technological changes, how they are affecting organizations, how they're affecting some of the more conservative organizations like public sector and charities in particular, and then look into corporate governance or enterprise resilience and how technology is playing a role in that or creating risks for enterprise resilience, and have maybe spend a longer time getting your views on how you see technology, what are the key technologies that really matter to you, and at the same time, what are your plans for using technology or protecting yourself from technology, either of these two. So I'll start first with a life of corporations or organizations. Yeah. So this is I think very familiar to you, that human beings, all of us, except all living forms except for animals, other animals, are actually living a lot longer. So in 1920s, the average lifespan around the world, including developing and developed countries, was about 34 years. Yeah. Today it's about 71 years. So it's more than doubled in the last 80 odd years. Yeah. So this is how we have been successful in improving our lifespan. But when it comes to organizations, when it comes to corporations or firms, and this, I'm using the word corporations or firms rather than organizations because that's where most of the data is available, we see a very drastically different trend. So in the 1920s, the average lifespan of a S&P Standard & Poor listed company, S&P index company, was about 67 years. Yeah, the average lifespan of S&P 500 index company. Just 3 years back, there was a research which found that by 2012, their average lifespan had reduced to 15 years. Yeah, so it's a completely opposite trend of how we are faring as humans, as individuals, to how our social collaborative efforts for economic collaborative efforts are performing. The average lifespan of an organization has drastically shrunk in the last few years. Now, what are the factors which are bringing about these change? I would classify them into three groups of factors. Number one is technology, which is primarily the focus of this discussion today. But there are also things about business models. Yeah? Business models are changing, which is bringing about disruption and eliminating organizations which cannot cope with these evolving business models. At the same time, what we are seeing now is the changing workforce. Yeah? So how employees, how workers, how entrepreneurs are working and are going to work in the future, and that will also change the way organizations will survive, maybe even more than 5 years or 10 years. So I'll look into a few of these in more detail now. When it comes to technology, and a lot of things about technology are usually hyped, yeah. But what we are suddenly seeing is that there's a sudden confluence, there's like a simultaneous confluence of several technologies reaching some level of maturity. Yeah, like when it came to 3D printing, for the last 20 years, we are hearing that in the next 5 years, 3D printing will be the next biggest thing. Yeah, same thing applied to maybe fingerprint recognition associated technologies or body electronics. Yeah, for the last 20 years, we have been hearing that in the next 5 years, it will be the biggest thing. But finally, that next 5 years have sort of come for many of these technologies, particularly automation and robotics, automation in particular, renewable energy, gene splitting, nanotechnology, social media related applications and functions, big data and data analytics, Internet of Things, and 3D printing. So many of these technologies are all sort of reaching a level of maturity together, all at the same time, and that's what is making a lot of changes possible. Just consider something like Uber. Something like Uber would not have been possible if you didn't have smartphones, if you didn't have fast mobile internet connection, if you didn't have excellent mapping functions available. So all these technologies were sort of precursors before you could have something like Uber really functioning. So that's what I mean, that all these multiple technologies are suddenly reaching a level of maturity at the same time, which makes it possible to create many of these new services, many of these new platforms, at the same time many new business models, which are really building some hope beyond the hype in terms of how the world will look like in the next 5 to 10 years. I'll give you some examples of these technologies. Number one I would like to talk about is the sensorization of things. So when it comes to eye, facial, voice, touch, gestures, and brain, we are being able to have electronic amplification and recognition of many of these sensory functions, which can be then further processed and then used for different applications. For example, in many phones it is now possible to scroll the screen just using your eye movement rather than using your fingers, right? You can use eye tracking in many of the cars, for instance. You can use your eye movement to see the back of the car. You can use it to see what's on the right of the car. Many of these functions are already available. Other things, with many of these could actually be used by charities themselves. For example, face scanning. In some countries they're experimenting with linking your social security or direct cash transfer schemes with face recognition software. So only the person who has that face recognition registered within the system can get the amount which is due to him. So many of these social innovations are already using some of these technologies. At the same time, you are having really futuristic applications. For example, mind control games. Some pilot studies have already been done in which you can just use your thinking to turn on or off electric bulb, for instance. So many of these technologies are going to change the way society is going to live in the next few years. But all these also mean that an enormous amount of data is being collected. They are collecting your data in terms of how many times your eye moves to the left, how many times you are blinking, when you are panicking, when your emotions are at a not very comfortable situation. So all these data could be captured if many of these applications are indeed going to be used by you or by anyone else, and which means there are also implications for privacy. There are implications for cyber attacks. For example, what if your emotions are being captured by an app and someone is able to hack into that app and send a love message on your behalf to someone else whom you never intended to, right? So these are some of the concerns that all of us will have to be careful about when it comes to using these technologies. Let's look at the other major technology, and this I would say is artificial intelligence. It's actually happening in the world of customer service in particular. So today, if you try to log in or if you try to interact with any airlines, the web pages of airlines, it's very hard to actually talk to a real person. You will always get a prompter, ask Jesse or ask someone, and when you type something it will give you a range of options, and then you select an option, then it gives you an answer back. So most of the customer interactions that happen today, either by phone or by email or web, are actually automated. These are robots which are interacting with you, pretty much providing you a reasonable level of service. So artificial intelligence, machine learning is already sort of mature in industries such as customer service, complaint handling, and so on. In fact, we did this recent roadmap for the BPO industry, the call center and the shared services industry in the Philippines. And the biggest threat they are facing is this fear of automation, whether millions of Filipino jobs will go away because it will now be possible to automate not just the typed interaction, but also the voice interaction for the request from the United States or United Kingdom. But this is more, I would say, basic level of artificial intelligence. The more mature forms are what we see through applications or software such as IBM Watson, which is not just good in one function like customer service or chess, but is good in many functions. Yeah, it's good in analyzing the planetary system to identify planets which could be having similar conditions as Earth. At the same time, it can beat Garry Kasparov in chess. Yeah, so these are the multi-talented applications which are sort of going to be beyond our imagination in terms of what they could be capable of going forward. But there are also the artificial super intelligence. These are sort of the unknown unknowns. Yeah? So what I would say that machines which are far more intelligent than human beings in many other fields. For example, we have a certain limitation in terms of how many languages we can process, yeah? How many sort of word constructs we can process. But maybe in the future we'll have these kind of super software which can do a lot more, which can create their own language. And the fear of robots taking over is particularly linked to this situation. Another case I would like to say is that one example of artificial intelligence is which we already see in many of our newspapers. Yeah, most of the financial articles or the sports articles are not written by human beings anymore. They are auto-written by software, and you can just Google such news reporting software. Many of them just pick up the key numbers like scores, who scored the goal from open sources, and they are very much able to come up with an article which is then printed into the newspaper. So again, these are basic forms, but they are already there. Now, when it comes to charities or corporate governance for organizations as a whole, this leads to the question about whether we will at some point of time use artificial intelligence to check our compliance, to check or monitor and evaluate our performance. Yeah? So will we have robots monitoring the schemes that we run for improving the healthcare of a village in, say, Indonesia? Yeah? So many such functions could be taken over by robots or automatic artificial intelligence enabled software going forward. Maybe even scanning your annual reports. Will there be software which can analyze patterns and come up with certain obfuscations which have been made by you in terms of your reporting? Yeah? So these are some of the possibilities which are there using technology going forward. I would next like to talk about business models. So that was technology, and this is about changing business models. Once again, even though consultants like to say the world is always changing, but this is really true that in the last 3-4 years we have seen a lot of such disruptive business models, whether it's Airbnb, whether it's Uber, whether it's Foodpanda. We are seeing some changes which were much more gradual in the last 20 years or so. Even with the coming of internet, except for things like online travel booking, things had not really changed that much as we have seen in the last 5 years or so. So what are the features of the new business models that are emerging? I would say these are these few. So first of all is on-demand economy, pay as you go. Very few people are buying software as a whole. They are buying subscriptions per month. They are buying subscriptions per use. Yeah, so most of these things are pay as you go. Everything is being offered as a service. So content as a service, analytics as a service, product as a service. Yeah, for example, in the United States, you don't buy a tractor anymore. You just rent it for the time that you need it. It's like an Uber for farm equipment. Yeah. Also, we are seeing IoT linked services. So many of these machineries, many of the lights, aircon, they are having internet addresses which can be used to develop new platforms which can help you to interact with these machines remotely. Yeah? So IoT services. And many of these services happen, or business models happen to be asset light. Yeah, they don't own the actual infrastructure or the actual building or the actual machines. So they are more like platform. So for instance, Airbnb is nothing but a platform. Yeah, same thing goes for Expedia. They don't own the assets. They're just linking up thousands of buyers with thousands of suppliers. Just to give you some examples of industries where such trends were not imaginable a few years back, and what we're seeing now, for instance, aviation. GE, which manufactures most of the aircraft engines and systems, they are now focusing a lot more on value-added services like flight efficiency, data analytics linked services. Yes, so they're focusing more on making revenues out of services rather than the hardware that they have in the system. Even for consumer goods, which, for example, Babolat, which provides hard disk drives, they also provide value-added services related to playing games on those servers. Healthcare, allowing physicians to monitor patients' devices, from very simplistic ones such as your blood pressure monitor being linked to an internet or web application, to very sophisticated ones which are on the pilot stage. For example, when it comes to caring for the elderly, some of the options which are being tried out is to check how often the taps are opened in the house. Yeah? So if an elderly person is living alone and you have an estimate of the pattern of how many times the kitchen water tap is opened, if you see some deviation in that, it sends a warning signal to the child of the elderly or the healthcare official linked to this person that maybe something has gone wrong. Yeah? Or even things like how many times the medicine bottle is opened. Yeah? There are sensors linked to that to check whether the person has taken medicines at the correct schedule that he or she is supposed to take. So many of these business models use these services as the main way of generating revenues rather than focusing on the actual product, the goods, or the asset which lies behind providing this platform. The third factor, as I mentioned, is the changing nature of workforce. And we did this study with MCI in Singapore. And what we saw is that there's this tremendous growth in freelancing worldwide. So just in the last 4 years, the number of freelancers worldwide have increased to over 100 million. And it's more than $1 trillion economy. Much of this is actually in the United States, United Kingdom, India, Bangladesh, Australia, and so on. There's both a push and pull factor to it. The push factor is relatively smaller, that people want flexibility, they want to work from home, and that's why they are taking to freelancing. Sometimes they can get better pay or better bill rates for the skills they bring to the table. But it is the push factor which is stronger in this case. Most of the companies today are very reluctant to offer long-term contracts or full-time positions to their employees, particularly in countries such as Japan or Spain. What we are seeing is that companies or organizations are increasingly moving towards a short-term contract-based operation for their workforce to reduce their social welfare costs and also the healthcare facilities that they provide for their employees. So that's why we are seeing this big increase in freelancing. In Singapore also, in some industries such as media, IT, design, up to 30% of the workforce could be freelancers. Yeah, not just foreigners, but also people within Singapore who work on such short-term contracts. But there are new models of working as well. Yeah, new models of working. For example, volunteering. Yeah, so people actually don't get paid for doing the work that an organization needs to be done. Galaxy Zoo, for instance, involves a lot of freelance astronomers who provide their services of scanning the skies for free to scan potential planets which may have Earth-like living conditions. Yeah, so it's a free service just because people are interested in this area. They are doing this work for free. The Good Judgment Project, for example, uses volunteer forecasters to predict real-world events. For example, terrorist attacks or cyber attacks. So it's a group of volunteers who are just passionate about keeping the world safe, who provide their own forecasts for such events happening. And often they have been more accurate than even the CIA's own forecast. Yeah? They can, of course, pay you in different forms, like just giving you a token prize. Yeah, for instance, Nokia has this ideas project which encourages people to share new innovation ideas, and for that they get an award. Yeah. Similarly, crowdsourced platforms used by other organizations are using these award or recognition or prize linked mechanisms to get work done by normal individuals. And we often don't realize that we are doing some work for the corporation while getting an award and recognition, but actually getting paid a lot less than what we would have been if we are a full-time employee of the company doing the same work. Yeah. So these are again some of the changes which are coming. Actually, in some cases, people are even paying money to do the work. Many of the charities, for instance, in Cambodia or in Latin America, they ask people, volunteers from around the world, to actually pay to come to their country and do charity work for their organization. Yeah, so these are the different ways in which organizations are coping with the changing workforce going forward. So in such a dynamic world, even the technology companies are finding it very hard to survive. Some of you may have heard the case of Theranos. It was the darling of the Silicon Valley just a couple of years back, and it had a stellar crash when it was found that it had lied about the mechanism in which its diagnostic tests work. By just using a small drop of blood, it said it could run a lot of blood tests, but it turned out that they had actually fudged many of the results and the way the whole process works. So again, a superstar company with superstar valuation had collapsed. A technology company had collapsed because it, of course, in this case, it's more of a case of unethical behavior. But they had faced this challenge to cope up with. Even companies such as Snapchat, Dropbox, Twitter, Square, all these technology organizations which had built the reputation of being disruptors had seen a drastic drop in their valuation in the last 6 months. Yeah, because they are not able to live up to the hype, or competition is providing a better solution than what they are offering. For example, for Square, what we are seeing is that other financing companies, SME financing companies like Cabbage, are providing much more attractive solutions. E-commerce platforms like Alibaba and Amazon are providing financing terms which are much more attractive than what Square is offering. Same for Dropbox. Google Drive is probably killing its business. Yeah, a visualization software company like Tableau is facing challenge from Microsoft, which is offering it for free in order to gain market share. So again, in this technologically, business model wise and workforce related changing world, we are seeing that even superstar technology companies are struggling to cope and survive. So the question lies that which are the companies which are going to be the most which are the ones which are going to live the longest? And actually, the longest surviving companies are rather low technology. Yeah, the oldest company in the world used to be is actually this Japanese company called Kongo Gumi, founded in 578 AD, ran for close to 1400 years before it got taken over by another firm in 2006. Yeah, so it's a very low tech. It used to make temples, pagodas, and castles in the for the Japanese warlords. That's how it began, and it was taken over only in 2006. The other oldest companies, again something to do with Japan, is also Hoshi Ryokan. Yeah, it was reputed to be the oldest hotel running and was also one of the oldest enterprises. It was later found that there's another hotel in Japan, I can't recall the name, which is actually 5 years older than Hoshi Ryokan. But there's some debate. Hoshi Ryokan later came back and said that no, there's some problem with the other company's history. Yeah, and even Chateau de Colin in France, close to 1,000 years old. Yeah, so again, very low technology companies. Many Japanese companies like Sumitomo, Mitsubishi, publishing companies such as Reed Elsevier, Palgrave. These are the companies which have actually lasted very long and relatively low tech in their way of operations. So we found out that some of the key characteristics of these companies was, first of all, about the vision and values. Yeah. So vision and values, if they're too specific, for example, if you say that your vision is to be the number one car company in the world, yeah, then it becomes very challenging. You could probably live for about 100 years, which is as much as the life of the automobile industry. Increasingly, what we are seeing is that automobile industry is being replaced by what we call the mobility industry. So these include things like hovercraft, includes things like personalized rail, includes things such as even your swings, which are being tested out, long distance swings to move people from one place to another. So if you rather have your vision as being the number one mobility company, you have a much better chance of surviving beyond 100 years. Yeah. So again, if you think yourself as an automotive company, at best maybe 100 years. If you think yourself as a mobility company, maybe you are thinking of 1,000 or 2,000 years of possible play bandwidth. Yeah. Again, many of the Japanese companies come to mind, Mitsubishi or Sumitomo, for example. Their vision is very simple, just to serve society. Yeah. So these are kind of vague yet somewhat specific and not very definitive vision, which allows you to build around things and allows you to cope with environment in a bit more flexible way, because the owner's mindset, the management mindset is also a bit more flexible in such situations. Unity and trust, of course, not just among the employees but with the customers. Conservatism and flexibility, I think a good mix of that is also essential. Conservatism in terms of, say, fiscal principles, in terms of how you decide on your investments, in terms of how you interact with the outside world, in terms of your monitoring and compliance. A bit of conservativeness in those goes a long way in ensuring your survival. At the same time, flexibility, trying out new approaches, coping with the outside world in a more flexible fashion helps a lot through continuous innovation. Customer focused, always thinking about what your stakeholders really need, so changing with that. For example, if you are an NGO addressing polio, does it mean that your life ends when polio ends, or do you move into new healthcare areas, the new healthcare problems going forward? So again, knowing your customers' needs that change with the times and adjusting yourselves with that. And finally, a sense of ownership in what you do, and not just from the employees but all the way to the owners of the organization. So here I'll just take a question from you. So all of you, I believe, are from non-governmental organizations, charities, and even some corporates are here. How many of you think your organizations will live 5 years from now? Can I have a show of hands? How many of your organizations think that your organization will continue to be there 5 years from now? It's about 30%, yeah. So about 30% of you. So it's quite a realistic audience, and you're fairly close actually to what the trend goes like. Among the S&P 500 companies, so about of these 500 companies, based on the pattern I showed earlier, which is the average life of these companies have reduced from 67 to 15 years, only 25% of them will remain by 2020. So you're pretty close. You said about 30%, I guess, from the show of hands. So only about 25% of these organizations will survive in the next 5 years. Yeah. So with that, I'll move into the last section of my presentation, which is around how the second last section of my presentation, which is to see a case study of how one of the most conservative organizations in the world, the government, is dealing or coping with changes in technology, business model, and workforce. Yeah. So what we are seeing is that one of the key business model innovations that has come in the government sphere of doing things is outsourcing. So outsourcing for government functions began with IT, human resources, strategy development, where they hire people like us to do their strategy, but also to very unique areas which was not imaginable before. Policing, for instance, in many US cities, policing is done by private forces. Yeah. Even in Singapore, you can say the auxiliary security forces are actually private organizations which are doing these functions. Prisons in the United States, in United Kingdom, Scandinavia, many of the prisons are run by private sector organizations, and they are hired on a contract, short-term contracts usually, about 3 to 5 years, and then they can bid for a tender and get selected again. Space travel, many of you must be familiar. Companies such as SpaceX, Virgin, they are doing much of the heavy lifting now around satellite delivery and refueling and resupplying the International Space Station and so on. Yeah. So again, very sophisticated areas involving big investments. Government is now outsourcing such functions all the way to defense. Yeah. Many of the fighting forces in Iraq and other countries, of course with certain repercussions, were actually private forces. Even today in the Middle East, many of the government armies, like the Arab armies, are actually using private mercenaries to do much of their killing and fighting, yeah, in these countries. So they are outsourcing many of these functions. And one interesting example is actually Sandy Springs in Atlanta, which went bankrupt about 5 years back, and it has completely outsourced its entire municipal functions to a private sector organization for 2 years. So right from licensing, right from utility bills, right from schooling, everything is managed by a private sector organization there. Yeah, so that's the kind of business model innovation that we are seeing. Also, they're using unique financing concepts, and this applies to NGOs and charities as well. One of the most well-known innovations here is the thing about social impact bonds. Yeah. So under this, a government or a charity issues a bond to shareholders, and these bondholders, they get paid only if the government meets their KPIs or the charity meets their KPIs. If they don't meet their KPIs, the donors or the bondholders, they don't get paid. Yeah? So you might say that it's a very nice thing for the government. They only have to pay if they succeed, yeah, and if they fail, they don't have to pay, right? But actually, it's the other way. If they fail, the next time they want to raise funds, it becomes immensely difficult. The cost of funds could triple or at least double. Yeah. So that's why it's a sort of a check and balance mechanism built in. If you perform, it's easier for you to raise funds and achieve more. And what it also brings in is a lot of transparency and monitoring and evaluation, because now these bondholders are the ones who are pressurizing you to perform, pressurizing you to release data about your functions, raising early signals for warning, and then accordingly forcing you to change your way of operations. Yeah, it's not just for government. Again, it applies for big NGOs and charities as well. Recently, there have been some issues in terms of how private sector has got into this space and tried to make money out of it by securitizing. But nonetheless, in the long term, this is one of the financing concepts which will gain a lot of popularity, not just in government world, but also in the NGO charity world. The other way governments are adapting to this changing world is thinking of different ways of achieving their goals. For example, charter schools is a very good example of how the government has managed to raise the standard of education, particularly in the US. It was finding it very hard to tackle the bureaucracy, the issues related to teacher performance evaluation. So instead of that, using charter school, using vouchers for poor families to opt for any school which they think is good for them, has created a lot of competition for these charter schools for the dollars, and to improve their performance at the same time, to get higher ratings, to get more students and their parents interested in putting their vouchers into that school. Conditional cash transfers, many of you may be familiar with that. It's actually paying people directly some cash amount if they promise to in turn do certain things on their own part. For example, sending their kids to school. So if they send their kids to school for a certain number of days, then they get paid by the government a certain fixed amount of cash. But we're also seeing unconditional cash transfers as well. Yeah, that's the other innovation that has happened, under which the government just without any conditions pays the poor families a certain amount of funds, because studies have shown that once it is given to certain target segments, they actually spend the money in a very sensible way, particularly groups such as women or groups of people in a society. they tend to have a certain monitoring and evaluation upon themselves enforced through the scheme. Yeah. Volunteering based resource allocation. For instance, in the United Kingdom, they are piloting a project where if you do social service, you may have to pay lesser tax. Yeah. So using these kind of schemes to encourage more people to take up some of the government and NGO role directly. So the government pays less, at the same time gets the same work done. In Singapore, the no filing of tax is such an innovation, and even like insurance, public sector insurance organizations like NHS, paying people to stay healthy, exercising and not smoking. These are some of the innovations which they are trying to cope with this world. So by 2050, our forecast is that the whole ecosystem in terms of providing public services will be very fluid. So just to help you navigate this slide, I would say that there are three essential functions of a government. First of all is idea generation and policy development. Second is regulations, monitoring and evaluation. And then you have execution and implementation. So it's a cycle. You develop the policy, you execute, then you monitor and evaluate, and then you regulate it again. Yeah. So what we believe by 2050, the key stakeholders like media, think tanks, international organizations, watchdogs, businesses, citizens, NGOs, and the government, everyone will have a role to play in each of these arms. Yeah. So an idea for new regulation, let's say, for example, in the United States, the whole issue about toilets for transgenders, it has been raised by NGOs, and then it comes to the government to act onto it. So policies can be drafted by NGOs and then sent to the government for the final validation. But it could come from the think tanks as well. Yeah, the policies could come from the think tanks. When it comes to execution and implementation, again, it could be done by anyone. The execution of a cash transfer scheme could actually be managed by an NGO. The government just gives the NGO the fund, and the NGO with its grassroots reach actually implements that project. In turn, it is monitored by some third-party agency. Same way for M&E, it can be outsourced, it can be done by a watchdog, it can be done by international organization, can be done by citizens themselves. Yeah. So going forward, any of these three big blocks of a society or government's responsibility areas can actually be taken up by any of these stakeholders. But what happens is that in such a situation, the government plays the role of the final enforcer or the final arbiter. Yeah. So just to summarize, all pillars of society will have their roles flexible. They will take up different chunks of the work, but the role will expand or contract on a case-by-case basis. Policies, ideas could come from anywhere. Implementation, execution, and monitoring largely outsourced, but the government retains the scepter of authority, the final say. So what the government would look from outside is as a virtual authority, as a platform provider linking up all these different stakeholders, as a vendor manager. Yeah, the government will become more like a vendor manager. And from the inside, it will be a performance-driven organization, very lean, contract-based, constantly balancing short-term and long-term goals, heavily networked with these different agents of society, and using technology platforms for managing such intricate collaborations. So how does technology affect corporate governance? This will be the last section of my presentation before I open the floor for discussions. So what we see is that technology can be used for different aspects related to corporate governance. Number one is related to stakeholder interactions. So your shareholders or the other key stakeholders in your board, for instance, they could be using technology for things such as virtual voting. Yeah. So for example, you have a motion for the organization about increasing expenses or increasing certain allocations to some functions. Instead of getting all of them to come together and vote on that matter, you can actually do it online. Yeah. So many of these apps are already available to allow virtual voting of shareholder or stakeholder intentions. Virtual annual general meetings. In the United Kingdom, for instance, the law already allows conduct of AGMs online. Yeah. Using platforms for stakeholder motions. So virtual motions, for example, I want to replace the CEO of my NGO, such motions can be raised to platforms such as change.org, yeah, or for other platforms, using Facebook, for instance, running campaigns to launch such motions that you believe should be adopted by your organization. And of course, there's risk management software, board governance software, more applicable for large organizations, but still IT tools which can be used by organizations such as NGOs and charities as well. Some of the interesting ways in which technology has been used for corporate governance is actually in terms of compensation disclosures. Yeah, what we have seen is this is a case in Iran where the public sector salaries were suddenly getting disclosed on Twitter. Yeah, and it came out that one of the CEOs of a public sector bank in Iran was actually drawing salaries from 5 sources while he was working for only one. It is common in Iran, if you have been there, for people to work in multiple jobs, but this person was only working in one job and getting 5 different salaries. So then there was a lot of pressure on all other government officials, senior government officials, to disclose their salaries. And then this whole thing started off people volunteering to disclose their pays over Twitter. Yeah. So this became like a big scandal. Almost the government toppled because of these multiple payments which are coming to many of the public sector servants in Iran. So again, using technology for management compensation disclosures could be an interesting way the world could evolve. Also whistleblowing. So when it comes to corporate governance, platforms such as WikiLeaks or Twitter can result in such deviations in the organization, making it much easier for whistleblowers to share out their concerns in a wider platform. It can be also used for different other functions. For example, big data can be used for monitoring and evaluation, reporting, financial, social, as well as environmental, risk management, and augmented compliance and audit. Yeah? So big data, blockchains, P2P systems, as well as machine learning. Just to give you an example, I am personally associated with an organization called TWC2 here in Singapore, and they work with migrant workers. And we used to have a soup kitchen where we maintained cards for every injured worker or worker with salary dispute to register their meal requests every day. And it was a very arduous process, particularly at the end of every month when all these cards had to be rewritten by volunteers, and we had a tough time doing that. Then we switched to an online platform, and it became much easier. After the first round of translating this, it became much easier to do the entire operation by giving a certain online number, like an identity number for every such migrant worker who came for the soup kitchen, and then using that to keep track of how many meals he's having and so on. But at the same time, it also gave us a lot of data. Yeah, it gave us data about nationality, gave us data about how many months he has been having problem in terms of his salary dispute, gave us the nature of the injury that he had suffered. So we could analyze things like how many back injuries, how many fractures, how many fingers cut. So all these data could then be captured by us using technology. Yeah? So big data and analytics can be used to monitor and evaluate our performances. Accordingly, estimate how many meals do we need at each point, estimating our budgetary requirements and so on. Blockchains, for instance, yeah, if you are familiar with bitcoins, are you familiar with bitcoins? So it's a digital currency in which the ledger is maintained by several individuals, and then there's a way of authenticating each other so that if one person makes a mistake, the rest of the system can automatically monitor and correct that mistake. So similar things can be used for charities operations as well. Yeah, with many charities, they collect a lot of data from the grassroots efforts that they do in terms of the health of the different segments that they work with, their age, their nutrition patterns, their family size, and so on. So any evaluation report on these factors could be monitored through facilities similar to a blockchain kind of operation to check whether the functioning or the reporting is really happening as the NGO is claiming. Yeah, so such compliance related things could use a lot of these new technologies going forward. And finally, as I mentioned, augmented compliance and audit. So using machine learning technologies to spot patterns of deviations which are out of the normal. Yeah, you can use that to have a better handle on whether things are going wrong, whether what you are reporting is different from what is actually there on the ground, combining it with other sources of public and private information. So these are the ways in which technology can be used for corporate governance, not just in corporate organization, but also for enterprise resilience in charities and non-governmental organizations. But there are a lot of threats and challenges as well. So when you collect so much of data, when you use all these internet-based systems, when you use these systems on which you may not have direct access and direct control, there are risks of cyber attacks. So for example, if you are working with sex workers, for instance, and you have collected all their information, if it is hacked, then there could be a lot of threat for the identity of these sex workers, and that can be exploited for blackmailing these people, for extracting money out of them. So there's this challenge of using technology for not just this management, but for your day-to-day operations as well. Data privacy, again, is a big issue, not just for the volunteers, but also for the target segments that NGOs and charities work with. Investor loss, for example, if a donor has transferred money to the account of the charity, and then suddenly there's a rogue employee who is able to hack the access and then siphon out a substantial amount of fund, it could lead to this significant investor loss. And at the same time, service outage. Yeah, many of the NGOs and charities today offer services on internet platforms. For example, you can register your daily nutrition on these software, you can register it on mobile applications. So if this system goes down, the entire service sort of collapses. Yeah. So these are some of the threats which arise out of new technologies, and therefore these risks need to be managed as well. Yeah. So you can use technology for managing risks, but at the same time you need to manage risks coming out of technology usage. They are both sides of the same coin. Yeah. So with that, I'll end my presentation. What I'll do is I'll take any questions for the next 10 minutes, and then I have a few questions on my own in which I would like to have a discussion among all of you in this room. Yeah. So any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
You talked about managing risk, privacy risk and all that. Can you please just elaborate a bit more? How do we, as data repositories, prevent our data from being hacked in this manner, right? And only that, if we start collecting data from other sources, how do we then prevent this data from going out, because you won't know who has accessed your network. So maybe you'd like to address these two questions.
Yeah, thank you. It's also a very tricky question, especially for smaller NGOs and smaller charities. When it's a large organization, like the Bill Gates Foundation or other such large organizations, they can of course hire external advisors, they can hire compliance experts, they can hire IT system or software developers who can build in these safeguards as well. But for smaller organizations, it is often a big challenge, yeah, because they cannot afford to spend money on hiring such external support, or often the amount of data and the amount of complexities are beyond their ability to imagine or even handle. Yeah. So what we have seen being used in some of such small organizations are a few strategies. Number one is to form something like an ethics or a privacy committee, a data privacy or data security committee, or a larger ethics committee. Yeah, and this committee consists not just of your own own organization's people, but also some outsiders. Yeah, and many times they would be happy to volunteer as members of this committee. So you get this ethics committee comprising of your individuals in the organization. You get some outside experts like lawyers or IT systems experts, and you also get some of the target segment people as well. So for example, if you're working with, let's say, sex workers or elderly, you get one or two representatives of them as well. So right from the conceptualization that what kind of data I need to capture, and it's also like data I really need to capture. Many times we like to always have our NRIC details, our address details, and they're actually not necessary for the service we are rendering. Yeah. So having these kind of committees to really have a look on what really we need to deliver our function. Yeah. At the same time, also deciding on what we need to protect ourselves to not fall into legal traps in case there is a breach. And thirdly, to come up with standard operating procedures. Yeah. And when you do that, you also learn from best practices from other organizations. So you can approach many of these NGOs in other functions, and more often than not, they are happy to help in terms of what have been their learning practices from operating in these areas. So learn from best practices, collaborate, have these ethics committees, really think about what you really need to capture, establish standard operating procedures, and most importantly, make it public so that people can scrutinize it. And then if there's any question or if there's any pitfall, then you can always sort of counter back, and at the same time get public wisdom around whether there are some loopholes around it. So often when you say that these are our practices without giving in a lot of details, you will get a lot of valuable feedback from the public using social media that, oh, there's a loophole here, maybe you should consider this, or there's this security breach here possibility which you may need to consider. So these are some of the tools which are being used by smaller NGOs and charities to adapt to such data privacy related issues.
We still need to keep computerized data, whether we like it or not, because there's too much to handle. But this data, our networks are open to attacks. We don't know how to protect them. How do we then protect ourselves? Because if this information gets leaked out, are there any tools we can use or any tools that you can recommend to help us prevent such attacks?
Yeah. So some of the, if you're using the cloud, for example, for storing your data, many of the cloud platforms, whether it be Dropbox or whether it be even Google Drive, they come with certain basic protection features. Yeah, even like two-factor authentication features, they come enabled with that. What you can also do, and often one of the things about cybersecurity is that the most number of breaches happen because of password control issues. Yeah, because you keep a password which is too easy to hack. Yeah, and even if such simple things are addressed, about 80 to 90% of the cyber attacks wouldn't actually happen. Yeah. So first option is to use such cloud platforms which already have some of the security provisioning, and also to sort of encourage, as I was mentioning, different groups. So one of the trends that I featured is how to use volunteering based services without paying to get many of these things done. So for instance, you can use say students in Singapore, IT related courses, to actually give you some free advice. And there are organizations in Singapore, student organizations, which help SMEs, which help charities to develop such solutions or safeguards around their IT systems and their IT frameworks. Yeah. So using such volunteering based approaches, using multiple, so that you don't have one person who is volunteering at the same time has a vested interest in eventually corrupting the data or using it, leaking it. So using multiple sources could be some innovative ways in which you can adapt to such a situation. In TWC2, for instance, the system that we developed was actually done by NUS students. Okay. Any other question? No? Okay. If there is no question, then maybe I would like to ask a few questions, and I would welcome views and opinions from everyone on board. First of all, I would like to get a sense of what kind of data do you capture for the stakeholders that you work with, yeah? And just to get a sense of what level of sophistication you have reached. So if some of you could just mention your organization you are representing and the kind of data that you capture from your stakeholder groups, yeah, that would be interesting. So any volunteers would like to mention about your operations? So you want to say something on that? Okay, if none of you are speaking, I will pick volunteers on my own. Maybe the gentleman from the Singapore Kindness Movement, yeah. If I can have your views on what kind of data you capture in your interactions, and if you use technology at this point.
We do not.
If you can introduce yourself as well. Sorry.
I'm Nava from the Singapore Kindness Movement. From the point of view of either donors or beneficiaries, I think we are unique because we do not really need to raise funds from public, and at the same time we also do not have direct beneficiaries to our services because we are mostly a community information dissemination based organization. So we do capture data when we have events or when we do receive donations, but we do not systematically store it on a computer database in order to keep following up to request further donations or to provide services. So most of the data we have are limited use, and we periodically purge our documents and our data that's on our systems because we don't need them for long-term purposes.
Okay. What about this table? Can I have some views from this table? How you use technology? Let's make it a broader question. How do you use technology in your operations? Any volunteers from this table? Otherwise, I'll pick an individual again. Maybe ma'am, the one on the left, would you like to
From Care Communities and Services Society, we are actually operating on an annual budget of about $4 million. A lot of our revenue actually comes from, of course, donations. I think in the last couple of years, of course, we have the government grants and the and aids and subsidies as well. For the corporate donations as well as the individuals, obviously we would capture information of their names and their IC numbers, addresses. Obviously when it comes to, because we are IPC, an IPC, institution of public character, so able to then give tax donation receipts. Some of this information will be useful for us to process and to also follow through with, so that there could be a continuity and regularity in donations towards our cause.
And do you use technology to deliver some of your services?
Very much so, and obviously computer data and use of technology is quite essential. But I think where we are right now, frankly, I am not aware if we are actually able to embrace some of these things that you have just shared with us, because perhaps I could ask a question back as to, are you foreseeing that we would have to thrust ourselves to embrace some of these, say, cyber attacks or, challenges in the next, 5 years or 10 years? That part I haven't quite, captured.
Yeah, I would say that a cyber attack is very likely on individual organizations, and it can strike all different kind of segments, whether it's the elderly because they have, for example, CPF accounts. It could be the younger people as well, like say ex-prison convicts, ex-convicts, because it could be used for blackmailing them. So multiple segments have exposure to that, and we have seen some data breaches already in Singapore before. and that's why the risk is always there. Yeah. So like I said again, try to get best practices, interact with other organizations which have established some kind of sort of a firewall around their systems, and also use volunteer services to adapt to some of these challenges. These could be some ways, but yeah, I think there is never later for dealing with cybersecurity related challenges. One question I would have, and I noticed that some people have left because of this threat of being picked out for commenting, but one question I would have is, many of us or people who work with volunteers, we have to give access to our systems to the volunteers. Yeah. So, and many of these volunteers are actually short term, like a student could be working with the NGO for 2 months and then he or she would disappear for the rest of his life, but still have the password and access to the system that the NGO is running on. So do you foresee any challenge in terms of giving access to your systems to volunteers, for instance, in your operation? Yeah. Any volunteers would like to answer that question? Maybe I'll pick this table now. Someone from this side, maybe. What about yourself?
We do give access to volunteers, but we are not too concerned about it because they have restricted access to those parts of the system that are relevant to them. And we have very tight control. When they come in, they are signed on, and once they have left, we take off all privileges from them. So we don't see that as a risk.
Mm-hmm. What is your organization again?
OMF International. We are a Christian charity.
Okay. So just to give you a reason why I raised this issue is that myself, I also run some migrant poetry competitions in different parts of the world, and we did a migrant poetry competition in Malaysia where we had refugees and migrant workers who recited their poems in a forum, and we had volunteers who were running the media outreach efforts, the day-to-day running of this event, and so on. And one of the challenges that we had was that some volunteers, they had taken a lot of pictures of children, child refugees, and they had posted these pictures on Facebook. So that was a big issue because the United Nations the UNHCR, they have strict guidelines in terms of how child refugees need to be exposed to the rest of the world. So then that was the challenge that we faced, that sometimes when we work with volunteers, it becomes hard to monitor the way they are functioning. Even if we have certain set guidelines, it is easy to breach those situations. Any other views on that in terms of working with freelance people and voluntary staff on your projects? Okay, the last question I would have is, what is the biggest threat that you foresee from technology to your operations? We have talked about data privacy and security, but are there any other ways in which you see that that your whole operations could be shut down because of the technology not working the way you intended? So any views on that? Maybe the second last table, anyone from there? Any volunteers? Ma'am, maybe on the first lady on the left.
I'm in the education sector. So my charity is raising financial assistance for needy students. So I don't really see a threat that will bring the whole organization down in that sense. So particularly my education sector is technical education, a lot of hands-on learning. So even let's say online learning, it may not replace that much.
Okay. Any other?
I work in the healthcare sector. My organization is SATA. One of the fears that we have is about cyber attacks. And So maybe we'd like to hear your views on how we could better protect ourselves. And secondly, a question to you. Of late, you see government agencies cutting off internet access. What are your views, and is that the best solution as far as the not-for-profit, the charity sector is concerned?
Okay. Thank you for that question. So when it came to cyber attacks, like I was mentioning in my previous comments as well, there is a definite threat, particularly when you work with elderlies and such segments who may not be that well equipped to deal with things like passwords and so on. And given that they may have a substantial amount of cash or savings in their CPF or other accounts. So therefore, it is always good to have protections in place. The good news is that it's also a very well-studied area as of now. And even though there is always a loophole and the hacker is always a few steps ahead of the protectors, but it's a very well-researched area, and you will find a lot of information free on the web in terms of how to have these safeguards, the firewalls around your system to protect data being hacked, both in terms of what you capture, what you give access to, how you refresh it, and what kind of different levels of security that you can build in around these systems. And many of them, as I was mentioning, if you're using cloud-based services, they come inbuilt with the cloud platform that you are hiring. So again, learn from best practices. A lot of it is available. People are happy to share. Use volunteers to build some of these firewalls and protection around your system. I think I didn't mention this, but this whole issue of bring your own device, the BYOD, is a big area of concern for not just government officials, but also individual organizations. And the fear has been largely, at least in the Singapore context, from the efficiency perspective, that people are wasting their time. There are some studies in the US which shows that on an average, people use 2 hours of their office time for checking out social media sites for YouTube and Facebook and so on. So 2 out of 8 hours is quite a substantial loss of time. But what is happening is that there's also the risk of security. For example, if they have internet access, we have seen mainly in financial institutes that people have actually emailed to their private accounts. They have emailed very confidential documents, especially when they're leaving the job. When they're about to leave the job, they often tend to have a flood of emails going out from their system to their personal accounts so that they can use it later for their own convenience. So internet access at work is one such issue which is quite real. We may think about independence and privacy of our own selves and our freedom to live the way we work, but at the same time we have responsibility towards the data we are dealing with, which do not belong to us, which belong to, say, stakeholders who could be really affected by these measures. So therefore, what we are seeing as sort of a backlash is of the counterattack from the companies or organizations is sort of like you just mentioned, not allowing internet access in your systems. The other thing that we are seeing is slowing down of internet speed as well. So we did a study where we found that corporate internet bandwidth subscription has actually fallen over the last 2 years. The bandwidth they are paying for is now actually much slower than what they used to have 5 years back. Why they do that is to make it very difficult to send long files over the internet. So if you want to send a 15 megabit file over that slow connection, it takes you more than 1 year or many disruptions. So people will eventually stop doing that. On the other hand, if you are also thinking of wasting your time by watching a YouTube video using that very slow internet speed, you will have to wait for 1 year to watch a 5-minute clip. So these are some of the things that companies are doing. Having policies around bringing your own devices, having slower internet connections, and having such rules around what information can be shared and what cannot be shared, or having even access to internet on their corporate systems. Okay, any final comments or questions? If not, thanks a lot for your time and thanks for listening to me. And I hope to interact with some of you again in the near future. Thank you.